Hello and welcome to my channel. In this video I'll be discussing Assassin's Apprentice by Hobb, the first book in the Farseer trilogy. So this is definitely a book that I've heard a lot of mixed things on. Some people really like this trilogy, others say it takes a long time to get into, and so I wasn't really sure how I was going to feel going into this, but overall, I had a really positive experience with this book. While I'll admit it took me a little bit to get used to the writing style of Hobb, I really quickly just got entranced by the narrative and the story that it was being told and the way that Hobb was telling that story. Assassin's Apprentice is the story of Fitz from the time he is about 6 years old until he's a teenager, and is told in the first person, which is a little bit different from most books in this genre that you typically see. It's a little more common in YA, and it's not a bad thing in general to be first person, but it is just something that also is a little bit different, but it really works well for this story. We start with Fitz, though, when he is 6, and he's being given by his grandfather to a guard, and his grandfather tells the guard that he's the bastard son of the eldest prince, Chivalry, son of King Shrewd of the Six Duchies, and he's told that they're not going to take care of him, gives him to him, what he will, and very quickly Fitz is thrown into a completely different world of politics and court intrigue, and yes, of course, assassination plays a role there as well. Now, right off the bat, I will say, of course, the bastard child of mysterious parents becoming the hero type trope is very much something that you see a lot. You might think that it sounds like this, but really this story takes a very different approach to it. Yes, he has a mysterious parentage. We don't really know who his mother is. It sounds like that might be relevant later, and there are some hints throughout the story, but he still very much seems to be a pretty normal boy. And as he grows up, he does find out that he does have some things that are special about him, some power to an extent, but more than anything, it's his lack of power and his feelings of being alone and of not being special that are the more bulk of his story, and he definitely makes plenty of mistakes. We don't get him just suddenly being incredibly intelligent, suddenly knowing everything and being able to do whatever he wants and be victorious. It's completely the opposite. There are a lot of moments throughout his story where he doesn't necessarily get fully what's going on. You see the subtext that he doesn't, because he's a kid, and even as he gets older, he misreads subtext, doesn't get social cues very well, and so the story that he's telling that sometimes can be a little bit different from what you're reading, and the way it's done, it's so realistic for the character, makes the character feel very real, because you're experiencing the world through his eyes, and he's telling you this story. Speaking of the character of Fitz, I've heard a lot of people have trouble connecting with the character, and that's one of the reasons that they're not necessarily huge on the Farseer trilogy in general. But I think really a lot of that is, if not quite intentional, just kind of a byproduct of the way the story's being told. Fitz is telling the story of himself, and he's the last person who thinks he has any sort of value or is important. He's looked at himself always as pretty worthless in general, and doesn't think that he has any merit, that he doesn't deserve love or friendship, and just feels alone. And when you have that kind of character telling their story, you're not going to get a whole bunch of reasons to be like, oh my gosh, I care about this character. It's, you kind of either do or you don't, I guess, but it really fits in with the theme with the narrator telling the story. He'd be the last person to tell you should care about him, but that's almost more endearing to the story overall, I think. Fitz isn't written as wise or honorable or important or really in any sort of positive way, and it's just, like I said, because that's not the way that he sees himself. He does go through trials throughout the story, yes, of course, including being trained to be an assassin, but there really is so much more to this story than that, and really the focus is exploring deeply into this character and intimately getting to know his innermost thoughts and feelings and hopes and dreams when he actually thinks he deserves to have any. Along with the main narrative being told by Fitz, we also do get some additional world building through the way of little clips of a history that he himself at a later point in the timeline is writing. So he's looking back and remembering and telling the story, and also giving these bits of this history, and so we get to find out a little bit more about the six duchies, the other kingdoms, and the unrest, what's going on with the wider world. I thought that was a pretty good way to give some of that information, because this book, unlike a lot of others, especially with first person, it never really cheats and does the thing where it cuts away and explains something. He's telling the story as he knows it and as he understands it. And there are plenty of things that he doesn't get, and Robin Hobb doesn't stop to explain it to you. It's you get it or you don't. He doesn't, and the story goes on. And so I've seen a lot of times with first person break away, like, they didn't realize that this was the case, or give you some exposition. You never really get that. You either see things that he organically hears about in the story, or he actually first person sees in the story, or you get some things later where he's reflecting on certain people, events, or places while he's writing his history. So it's an interesting way to do it without, like I said, feeling like you're cheating with the little cutaway. And it makes this a really difficult kind of narrative to write, but Robin Hobb definitely seems up to the challenge in this book. Through a combination of first-hand experiences, things he hears, and the history he's writing, we learn there's a lot of unrest in the Six Duchies, and a lot of this has to do with what are called the Red Ship Raiders, who are part of the Out Islanders, who originally is where the people of the Six Duchies came from, the kings and the people who live at Buckkeep. But these Red Ship Raiders are a new group, and not only are they destroying, but they start doing what ends up being called forging. And that's where they kind of take all of the humanity out of people and leave them as just shells that kind of have only their most base desires. This was a really interesting concept, and one that I imagine is going to be looked at a lot more later, because we don't focus on it a ton, once again, because it's not directly affecting Fitz. And so he hears about it, he has some run-ins where he sees more things about it as well, but it's not something that's super important to him, so it's not something we spend a ton of time with the narrative. And that's something too, I could see where some readers might be thinking, I want to hear more about that or this event, but that's one of the things that in some ways it can be a drawback when you don't have that third person omniscient presence where they see all, they know the thoughts. This is really a different kind of book, and like I said, it comes with challenges, but really when you're trying to do what Robin Hobb here was trying to do, is tell this really intimate story of this one particular character, this is the best way to do it, and it really worked out well. Even with it being a first-person story, we do actually learn still a ton about other characters and how complex they are. And sometimes it takes a while to unwrap, because once again, Fitz doesn't always understand things that are going on, and so he's learning about these characters organically, as do we, and the way that we see so many of the complex pieces of Fitz as well, and others, was interesting to read also. You have Fitz who oftentimes, when he doesn't know what to say, would just stay silent, so a lot of people kind of thought he was just dumb and not too bright, and also made it so that sometimes people would just kind of chat in front of him and ignore him because he didn't really talk much. And his feelings of inadequacy and aloneness, while also forming some kinds of relationships with those around him, was an interesting read as well, and just seeing the way that he perceives these relationships, sometimes as being more important than they are, sometimes as being less important than others perceive them to be as well, and it's a really interesting look into his psyche with those relationships. Now, I do see how this narrative could be a challenge for some readers. It is a different kind of story and not something you typically see in epic fantasy like this. It's a very differently crafted narrative, but honestly for me, Robin Hobb just wrote it so well and did such a good job with it that it really worked for me. I didn't have a ton of complaints, and I didn't necessarily get like a really deep connection to the character like I have other characters, so I do see where that's coming from, but it's hard to look at a book where you understand a character more based on the way the narrative is crafted. As for the pacing and overall plot, we're kind of in the middle there as well, which is, I know some people really like fast-paced, and this isn't slow-paced. It really is, like I said, in the middle, because we tend to skip over slow parts. There's sometimes where we'll skip weeks, days, even years at a time when there's nothing really of import that Fitz is looking back and telling us about. But there are also lots of moments that are really important to Fitz, but they may not be as important to you as the reader. So we get that kind of middle ground there. It did for me, each chapter, and the chapters were decently long, each chapter tended to kind of almost feel like its own little story. And oftentimes when you're jumping around, that's important as well, but you kind of had your start, here's what this chapter is, and each one had a little bit of an end. So it's kind of like looking at individual memories. There is very much an overall plot, but when you're moving over so much time in a relatively short time, this isn't an overly long book by any means, it's just kind of that middling pace through, not super fast, not action-packed, but that's really not what this book is trying to be at all, so it's definitely not a failing, but it might make it so that it's a little jarring for some people to read if this just isn't the kind of story that they're used to. So really, I guess what I'm trying to say, and I hate to say it, but this is one of those books that you probably just have to give it a shot and see if it's for you. I think if you get a few chapters in and you're just absolutely not feeling it, it probably isn't for you. If you get a few chapters in and you're good with it, even if maybe you're not crazy into it, I would recommend to keep going. It's not overly long, like I said, and the ending, at least for me, I think was very rewarding, and I most certainly thought this was worth the read. Overall, I did really enjoy this book. I thought it was a really nice setup for a lot more to come, and I think there's so many different directions to go, and there were a lot of really good elements in this book. It's definitely not, a new instant favorite for me, but it's something that was good, and I enjoyed, and I definitely will be continuing to read the other books in the Farseer trilogy at least, and then maybe I'll decide from there. But I definitely will be moving forward because I just thought this was a really well-written and enjoyable book. With that, that is my opinion and review on Assassin's Apprentice by Robin Hobb, book 1 in the Farseer trilogy. If you enjoyed this video, then feel free to give it a like, and if you want to see more of my content, then feel free to subscribe.